I want to take a couple of minutes before we get into the podcast and explain a bit more about the changes happening. Due to the response our country had with COVID, it greatly affected my ability to do my job around the country, as I had been doing with churches and organizations for many years. Like many other people, I did not see a paycheck for a year, and 2021 is looking like a carbon copy of 2020 in many ways. I did not feel released by God from what I had been doing with CV Ministries. January came, and I felt that God was releasing me at that time. As a result, I've taken a position as the director of operations for a multi site Christian school. Going forward, what I do for CV Ministries will look a lot different, and the owner of Core Values has asked me to continue in whatever capacity that I can. I've been encouraged by many that were aware that I was considering ending the podcast and knew about the changes that were happening in our lives. And that encouragement was that we continue with the podcast. This time has been a real test of our faith for my wife and I, and wanting to be obedient to what God has for us. And God has made himself clearly known as we have been faithful to him. Up until this week, there were no guests lined up, and I was just trusting God on what the next step is. If you are a regular listener, rest assured, God has provided some new guest possibilities for several weeks, and I will just trust God in the rest of it. I may even replay some of the most listened to podcasts at some point as well. If the opportunity ever arises again to do our hands-on seminars, it will look dramatically different without compromising content. But you can contact me about those details if that's something you want to talk about. One final note. It was encouraging to see so many individuals and churches take advantage of the 50% off of our resources that we were offering and build training libraries for their teams with those resources. So at this time, I'll just leave that update at that. And let's go ahead and get into the podcast. Welcome to the Church Security Through Prevention podcast, and I'm your host, Daniel Blevins. My guest today is not a stranger to the podcast or the church security community. Paul Buckner, who is one of the church safety guys, contacted me about a situation that happened at a church near him that he was consulting with. This is a great example of how fast something can go wrong, and fortunately for this church, there was no loss of life. As we unpack this incident, there are many other things within this that are discussed, and I'm sure that could even go deeper in your own training. As usual, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast, as well as do a Google review for us. All right, so let's talk with Paul and learn more about the wake-up call that this church had and so many need to have. Part 2 of this podcast will come next week. I hope that you'll come back as I continue my conversation with Paul Buckner. Paul, welcome to the Church Security Through Prevention podcast.
Glad to be back.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. It's not like you haven't been here before, right?
Right.
Yeah, which is great. It's always a lot of fun to have you on, and always good conversation. And it's always some of the podcasts that get some of the most listenership, let's say, afterwards, because it's oftentimes topics that you bring that are very relevant to what's going on in there, and that's no different today. Today we're going to talk a little bit about a situation that you ran into at a particular church and how vital it is for churches to pay attention to really what's going on and how they're doing things.
Yeah. I don't know what title you're going to choose, but the words "wake up call" come to mind, or nightmare scenario. So yeah, and this could fall also under, you and I've talked several times about mistakes made and lessons learned. Oh my.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like that wake up call. I actually wrote it down. That's probably a good call for this, because it kind of was a wake up call for this particular church.
Amen.
All right. So tell us a little bit about what you observed and how this has unfolded for you.
Yeah, so I ended up having a conversation with law enforcement, and I've got to be careful. The location, some of the specifics, I can't talk about. It's an ongoing investigation. Yeah, there's still some pieces that are moving it up in the air. But had a conversation with a member of law enforcement that I chaplain, and he was kind of unpacking for me this situation. And they had an ongoing threat from an individual who has a history of violence, has access to weapons, had taken pictures of himself with weapons, had written names on cartridges, and these things had been coming in from different directions that people have been talking about, and the had caused problems at other churches. And in this instance, he had said he was coming to this church after being trespassed, whether they liked it or not. And I really felt in my spirit that I needed to be there. So I spent a good chunk of an afternoon on a Saturday with that officer at that church. And I know this pastor and I know this church. And so I really want to preface this conversation by saying I have nothing but respect for the officers that were there, and I have nothing but respect and love for this pastor and his church. But this is the kind of situation, I think, that unfortunately too many churches in our country, and maybe even outside of our country, would fall into, not being adequately prepared for a credible threat. And as I unpack this, the listeners, it'll probably set their teeth on edge, but I hope that people at home will very seriously listen to this and go, oh, wow, this could have been us. And by the grace of God, it didn't turn out bad, but it could have been a disaster. It could have been a front page of the newspaper, all over the country news story. And so I decided I wanted to be there that Sunday, which was the next day. Having had multiple people describe this guy's history, having had extended contact with law enforcement about the situation, I talked to the pastor, and I said I'd really like to bring some people to be in the parking lot, because their church had concealed carry permit holders, but didn't have a dedicated team that was walking 3 layers of protection, didn't have someone at the door, someone in the parking lot, radios, etc. And I really felt like being forewarned was forearmed. And so I got to the church. There were law enforcement in the parking lot, and they were trying not to disturb the service. And so I did a quick walk around the church. They had locked all the doors except the foyer doors. Very good start. They have security cameras. I would say this is maybe a majority of the churches that would be listening to this podcast would have something similar set up. Unfortunately, no presence in the foyer and none in the parking lot again. So I had a gentleman show up that does executive protection like myself. And, he's like, hey, boss, where do you want me? And I had a young off-duty police officer show up, and he had been, given permission to be there. And so I was doing a quick walk around with them, and I said, I'd really like to have a roving patrol. And I said, I'm gonna be stationed over here. Law enforcement's got the front. I'd like to have a roving patrol because unfortunately this guy has a 360-degree access to this church. We'd been given some intel, and we've been told this guy has a strong history of violence. He's fought law enforcement. He's very wily, so be prepared for the unexpected. I mean, it's literally a nightmare scenario. And before I go on, do you have any comments or questions?
No, I mean, it's a lot like what we've talked about before, and I've talked about with other guests too. It's how key it is, and as you unfold this, people will see a little bit more and more of this. But how vital it is that that we have that outside protection. That we have those zones of protection essentially, because we would much rather deal with something outside than after it gets inside. And I just had that conversation with some family members recently about their church, where they have nothing. They don't train, and they don't go to the church anymore. But for 30 years they did, and they just recognize, especially through knowing what I have done for so many years, that there's definitely some gaps. And even their mentality was, well, we just need to do something on the inside. And I said, well, wait, you need to have somebody on the outside, because if nothing else, just to be able to identify and call out, hey, lockdown or whatever the case is, in that. So, I mean, you're right. There's, what you described as far as the way that church is set up with the cameras and doors. Yeah, there's churches that are doing certain things. And yep, that's great, but that's not necessarily a showstopper in many ways, as people see here in your story as well.
Yeah. Well, and before we are done, I've had a couple of weeks to really, really introspectively think about what I would have done differently. Some of these failures are mine, and that's painful. for a guy who does church safety and has done it for better than a decade and is trained in executive protection. And so I want to go back and unpack those. And this is literally a painful, like, mistakes made, lessons learned thing. But so anyway, we're at the church and I'm getting these guys positioned. It took us about 60 seconds. We did a quick walk around the outside of the perimeter of the church. These guys are getting ready to hop into a pickup truck, and I'm going to have a badge carrying police officer with an executive protection trained, very solid individual on a roving patrol, with law enforcement protecting the front, myself protecting the opposite side of the building. And as we clear the corner and we come back up, law enforcement is bringing the guy out the front doors of the church in handcuffs, and they're sitting him down. And I'm looking at these guys, and I mean, I'm telling you, alarm bells are going off in my head, and I'm like, what in the world? Well, he is very wily, and what this guy had done, he was expected to be either on foot or in a specific vehicle, and he was going to hitch a ride with an individual that he lives with. Well, being the wily individual he is, he had some other folks bring him up, and they came across the parking lot, pulled up under a canopy, as though they were attending church. He dove out and sprinted. He grabbed the doors, came in the only set of unlocked doors, sprinted across the empty foyer, across the sanctuary, and made a beeline for the stage. And this is one of those situations, and we can come back and unpack this further, but this is probably what would happen in most churches. Action beats reaction, not having an SOP for what you're going to do. Nobody wants to overreact, and therefore most of us would underreact. He makes a beeline for the stage, flops down in some form of a exaggerated repentant pose, jumps up, does some weird dance, and then begins to do like a mock worship at the top of his lungs at the front of the church. And this gal comes running out the front doors. Now, meanwhile, back at the farm, we're on the back of the church, having literally just walked around the church and coordinating, hopefully, what was going to be a solid defense. And I get emotional about this to the point I'm actually trembling slightly talking about it. And so she runs out the front doors and she's like, he's inside. And so law enforcement takes off running. They do a pincher maneuver, very good per their training. He doesn't like to be tased. And so he surrendered and didn't cause too much of a scene. Aside from that, he's known to fight. And so they take him outside and he is arrested for trespassing. So there's other things that are going on there, but I just was completely floored. And if it had been a paid executive protection gig, I would have expected to be fired. I'm just going to be honest with you. And I say this, it's embarrassing, but I turned to the guys and I said, they patted this guy down and checked him for weapons, and he didn't have a weapon on him, thank God. And I turned to the guys I was with and I said, that was a failure. I mean, thank God it went the way it did. Thank God he surrendered without a fight. But had he had a gun or a knife or a baseball bat, we could be looking at a mass casualty incident. And he's not a little guy. And so, all's well that ends well. And there may be even a chance this guy gets long-term care because he really needs it. He needs Jesus and probably some medication for a long time. And so let's put a pin in that there. And I'd love to get your observations on it.
Yeah. So, a couple things just to highlight a little bit. Like what concerns me with the mindset that many of these churches have, and they don't necessarily train as often as they probably should for scenarios just like this. I had a guest on, and we had a great conversation about the importance of training with scenarios. And this is just one of those great examples of scenarios in so many different ways that you can do it. But there are several churches, and I continue to see them and hear from them and whatever they're just like, their security team is nothing more than just certificate holders, basically. Mm-hmm. That, concealed carry individuals that have little to no training, and do they have the right discernment? Can they make the right judgment calls? How many could have possibly reacted poorly in that and caused a liability issue for themselves and the church by not responding properly? The other aspect too is as we've seen in videos and different things where you have different people that come up to try and escort somebody out or soft hands, out. from what you've described from this guy, you made the statement that he was known to fight, but in reality, he was a trained fighter,
Mhm.
essentially. So he could have really done, if it wasn't handled properly, if people got too close. We always talk about, create enough distance to protect yourself as you're engaging, if necessary. And part of the reason to have, if you're carrying lethal, that you have a non-lethal response as well.
Yeah, amen. Especially against somebody who he's not. I mean, I'm 6'4" and 215, and I'm relatively fit. He dwarfs me. I mean, he's a large lad. As a friend of mine says, he's a full grown man, and that's a very real concern. And I mean, they were able to continue the service. As I understand it, the praise band never missed a lick. I mean, that's impressive. That's that Western where the piano player keeps playing through the shootout, but they kept up, and people were able to stay in there. But a failure to plan is planning to fail. And again,
Right.
I have no um, we just don't know what we don't know. And so I have no hard feelings towards the church. Like I said, I'm related to people that got baptized in that church. I love this church family, and it has been a wake up call for them. I've put them in touch with some friends who are very good at teaching church safety, and the church safety guys are going to be sending some resources to them in the form of books. And I'll go and do some walkthroughs with them, and kind of help them. But they're going to have to. It's a very steep, very big learning curve, and so I think as churches, sometimes God gives us a wake up call. And again, I mean, this could have been a Sutherland Springs. This could have been a white settlement so easily. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, a lot of our churches would not have passed this test.
What would you consider the size of this church to be, just to kind of give a point of reference?
100 people or so, probably.
Yeah, and this is similar, in the same conversation I had with family. I explained to them that most of the churches that see incidents are these smaller churches
Mm.
around the country. It's the rarity, but if you were to look at all the incidents that happen every week around the country, most of them are tied to the smaller churches.
Yeah. Well, and we have this "it won't happen here" thing, this mentality. I had a young man turn to me the other day, and he wanted to join the church safety and security group on Facebook. He wants some training. His church has been talking to him about joining their safety team, and he's about 30. And he said, "I really don't think we're going to see anything happen at our church. Most of the folks are older, and it's so easy to fall into that mindset." And I said, "Well, we have to
Right.
remember that the Sutherland Springs shooting, which was a horrible situation, the man that came to do the harm was a son-in-law." And I said, you never know when you might be targeted because of a video you put up where you were talking about sin and somebody took exception, you know.
Yeah, that domestic spillover is huge. You just don't know, and that's something that a lot of the smaller churches know. It's like, we know everybody and everybody's good, and there's no issues. It's like, but do we really know everybody? How many years did I spend wearing a mask and not really letting people know who I was or what I was dealing with or anything else? And that's happening in churches all over the country.
Oh, I mean, my last church where I was at for 25 years, sometimes you have situations where people come in from the outside for counseling. And we had a gentleman, and it sounds like a joke, but it happened. And my pastor brought the concern to me. But there was a family that came to the church for counseling, husband and wife, marital counseling. And in the middle of a conversation, the guy's like, "Well, I don't understand what I'm supposed to do different." And our pastor was like, "Well, you need to stop doing drugs and stop cheating on your wife." And the guy leans across this desk and goes, "I'll kill you." And our pastor's like, "First and foremost, that's a threat. I'm going to be involving law enforcement. Secondly, we have an armed, highly trained safety team. That's a very bad idea." And that he took the bull by the horns. And I think that guy, he never did anything. I think that guy, he may have been just talking out his hat, but I think he also needed to know there are consequences for your actions. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of churches, we have a tendency to downplay things more so than we should.
Right. Yeah, yeah, and that's a regular conversation too that that we need to either have with people or to just realize is that years ago somebody would make a threat or even a suicide, like, oh gosh, life's terrible, I just feel like I could just kill myself. And years ago we kind of like shrug it off, like, haha, that's funny, knowing you really won't do it. Nowadays we can't do that. If somebody makes a threat towards themselves or others, we have to take it seriously, because if we don't, as it's proven time and time again across our country, that my boss with core values calls it leakage. He's a psychologist, and everybody leaks. And it's a matter of paying attention and recognizing these leaks that people are having in their lives and what they're saying and what they're doing, and then coming alongside them at that, early on in that, to help mitigate it from getting worse.
See, I like how you said leakage. I've heard the term before, and it's scriptural. Out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks.
Right.
And so there are little warnings in there that people say and do, and if we are paying attention. And you mentioned earlier about domestic spillover. This gentleman, to my knowledge, he wasn't related to anybody in the church in this last scenario, but he had become a very real and a very clear present danger. And thankfully the church took steps, because had it not been for the presence of law enforcement in the parking lot, who knows what his next step would have been after he got done with his what seemed to be a mock worship session. And for me, and if you're ready to move on into what I feel like I could have done better, there's a lot there that I think could have been done better.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I've trained in the EP. I've done high risk executive protection, and a lot of it that can't be talked about. It's way less glamorous than it sounds. It's a lot of boring time sitting in vehicles and sitting in rooms and standing outside of doors. But had I been working for the guy that trained me, I would have been like, sir, if you would like my resignation. And I've got a call into him. I told him, when you've got a minute, I've got some stuff to tell you that happened at this other church, And so I was really doing what I could to, I didn't want to alarm people. And I had told a couple of the guys that were there, they're like, we would like to carry, that were law enforcement, we'd like to carry rifles on our chest rigs, because this guy is a very credible threat. And I said, if you're going to be up by a vehicle or something where you're not high profile, I think that's fine. But what I don't want to see is, I don't want people to panic because this guy is, because this guy's a threat, but I don't want people to panic. And I think that was still sound judgment. I think if you're at a vehicle and you can quickly get to the threat, that's one thing. And they were wanting to catch him as he came into the parking lot, which is very sound. But what I would do differently is I would go to the pastor and I would say, listen, my background. I would like permission to coordinate security in your parking lot, as opposed to I would like to bring a couple of folks that are qualified and help in the. So it would have been a different conversation. And then I would have already had the guys in a roving patrol pattern. I would have arrived about an hour early. If it was an official thing, I would have arrived at least an hour before church started. I would have had
Sure.
all the moving pieces in place, and shame on me for not doing that. I attended an early service at my church, and it's better part of an hour drive between the two of them. Had I the opportunity for a do-over, a mulligan, I would be there about an hour early again, having that roving patrol. Then I would turn to law enforcement and say, if you're willing, I've been asked to coordinate security in the parking lot. I'd like to have one of you standing under the canopy at the doors. And then I would have put one of my people in the foyer, and I would have had all of the external doors locked. So once the service started, we know what this guy looks like. Anybody else that's coming up to the doors is going to be greeted in a friendly manner and allowed in. So I would have had a law enforcement member right at the external side of the doors, and on inside in the foyer to coordinate an inner defense, I would have put a member of my EP team. And one of the things that we were not able to get quickly enough was radios. And this, without comms, you've got nothing. And it was just something we didn't have enough time to get radios and get them in play. And I would have had radios on all 4 law enforcement officers that were there, and on myself and the other EP team member.
Yeah. Yep. That communication piece is huge. And even in, my current job, I'm realizing that that is going to be something I'm going to have to address. Um, with my with my new employer as well, is, how do we make sure that that communication piece is better than what it currently is?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and to your point, I mean, going back to Carl Chen, when he was walking down the steps, and there was a threat in the foyer, the lobby of the building, and he was thinking that it was something minor, and he was congratulating himself on a job well done. We need to be in that condition yellow. I mean, not freaking out, not like a rabbit sitting there waiting for anything to go wrong, but
Paranoid.
exactly, well said. But we do need to be condition yellow. And I'm really happy where I'm at my church. We're building a really solid security structure, and the guy that is the director where I'm at, I'm kind of a lieutenant maybe within that structure, and we have three layers of protection, and I've got my parking lot guys where they're very friendly, and they're not security per se, but they help us look for certain things and people that are in need. Medical, we'll have a homeless person come up and they want to have a conversation, and so one of my team members will actually contact me on the parking lot channel and actually say, "Hey, Paul, can you meet me at aisle one?" And all of those things build, they build that third layer of protection that we need. Because again, forewarned is forearmed. Because had this happened, God willing, had it happened at my church, I pray it never does, maybe we could have intercepted this guy in the parking lot and had him on the ground in handcuffs and being escorted off campus, and 15 or 20 people would have known. He would have, God willing, never made it into the foyer.
Right. Is there a chance that, from that, from him being arrested, is there a chance he could come back?
Absolutely. And that is one of the biggest concerns here is, in my state, understandably, it's hard to get somebody permanently committed. You need checks and balances, because we don't want those 1920s disasters and 19 teens disasters where people who really are not mentally ill are lobotomized in facilities. I mean, that's where those horror stories come from. But at the same time, we need to be able to get people who need mental health care. We need to be able to get them care. And when they will not take their medication, which is the case in this instance, and this guy is all but criminally insane. I mean, he's got a mental illness, but he's dangerous. And then, there's a difference between the person that's got a mental difficulty, and they're actually quite pleasant, and they're not explosively, angry or dangerous, or they don't get physical. I mean, many of our churches have folks in there who have setbacks and disabilities, and they're just part of our congregation. But yeah, there's a very real chance he could come back, and I have to be careful what I say. Law enforcement is taking steps to get him the long-term care he needs.
Sure.
So if you hear this, say a prayer, because we want this guy to get the care he needs. One individual turned to me that is related to that church, and he said, "This guy concerns me. I think he's almost the poster child for an active shooter." And I told him, I said, "I'm so glad to hear people in ministry and in churches starting to sit up and take notice and say, hey, this reminds me of," and as an aside to this that I think is so crucial, I think it behooves us as church safety team leadership, or if your leadership is not motivated, you yourself, if you're one of the grunts, to read books about active shootings. And they're not fun. I have wept. I'm not ashamed to say I have wept reading some of these books, but as I read them, I'm like, oh wow. And you can see where this came from, and you can see the progression of where it went. And as hard as it is, if we're not, I mean, we're supposed to be as innocent as doves, but as shrewd as vipers. We have to know the potential enemy and the potential threat. And if we can recognize that within our churches, like we had a young man that his dad died. I've talked about it in other venues. And in a nutshell, we disarmed him. I was given his dad's firearms when his dad was in the hospital to keep him from being stolen. The dad did not want the son to have them because of the concern that the son would try to hurt someone. And the son has some definite mental difficulties. And I went to my sheriff's department and I said, look, I don't want one of these local officers to have to face this guy. I don't want anyone to have to hurt him or kill him. But my concern is because he wouldn't have been skilled with them. But we both know that does not necessarily mean much.
Right.
And if you walk right up to somebody, it doesn't take skill. And so I said, I don't want this to become the problem that I can see coming. And by the grace of God, they took it seriously. And I believe we prevented a train wreck. And if there's anything, I guess, that I want people to take notice of, it would be two things. If I want people to sit up and go, oh my, that could have been us. And I want your thoughts on this. But one of them would be, are you adequately protecting your flock? Because if you're in the situation that this church was in, you're wide open for this level of a nightmare scenario. And secondly, is sit up and take notice and get ahead of potential problems. Don't overreact, but get ahead of potential problems to get people the care they need before a threat can happen. Because none of us want to be, I mean, I've talked to Frank Pomeroy. He's an amazing guy, but the pain and the haunted way that he tells the stories, none of us want that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. You're definitely right. It is, adequately preparing to protect the flock. But, even as you were talking, what comes to mind is all too often what we see happen, particularly after an incident happens that hits the news nationally or otherwise, then you have churches that are primarily focusing on that active killer situation that could happen in their facility. And I say active killer intentionally because I like Colonel Grossman, don't agree with the term active shooter because I'm an active shooter. I like to actively go shooting regularly on that.
Anyone, exactly.
That's right. So, but regardless, but the active killer situation, and that's where the focus really is, not realizing that there's so many other components to that, which we see in the example that you gave today, that just situationally aware and having those zones covered appropriately, being able to engage somebody like that to de-escalate the situation and perhaps just alleviate any kind of confrontation of in any way. But if not, then do they have the necessary defensive tactics skills to, if they had to defend themselves against an attack from an individual physically, could they do that? There's individuals that I've seen on different forums that just say, well, I'd just pull my gun if I was in that situation. Well, defensive tactics is also just, are you able to protect that gun from being taken from you in an altercation? I mean, there's so much to it that far more than people actually realize, the training that needs to go into place if you're going to carry a firearm at your church, and that not every situation calls for that hammer, and not every situation, for that particular nail.
I think you make a great point there, because being a chaplain for better than 10 years alongside law enforcement, you hear these stories. They're told anecdotally as amusing stories over the dinner table or in a patrol car, where a guy tased his partner. And generally it's the person who got tased by his partner who's telling the story, like where they call it drive tasing. And so they're in the middle of an altercation. I had a guy tell me that he was in the middle of an altercation with someone, and another officer ran up, grabbed his arm bar, and put his arm in an arm bar.
Yeah.
These are people that are trained, and many of them have had to fight. Adrenaline and stress and the intensity of the moment are very interesting, what they do to the human mind. And so, to your point, training under stress, I think of John Lee O'Reilly, who teaches people to de-escalate, and you do this under stress. That's huge, because first off, if you can de-escalate somebody, you don't even have to fight. But then if you've never trained under that stress, and then somebody does something, indecision kills. And so, like you said, you don't want to overreact, but you don't want to underreact. And I've talked to people where one of their fellow police officers has punched them in the face. One guy said, we were in this fur-flying fight, and say that 10 times fast, but he said, we were in this terrible fight, and one of the deputies that was with him bit him. Like, it was a terrible fight. He said he got bit on the front of the shoulder, almost on the pectoral muscle. And he's like, same team. And I say that not to embarrass anybody in a department, but these are the realities of an all-in fight. And if we ever face something like that, we do need to have those skills. And unfortunately, every year, even police officers or members of our military have their duty weapon taken away from them, and they lose their life to their own weapon. And I don't know about you, but that would be, to me, just about the worst possible thing that could ever happen to me. I'll give my life to protect the flock, but to lose my weapon and have it turned on people I care about, yeah, that'd be terrible.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned John Riley, and if people don't know who he is, he has a great organization called Gentle Response, and I would highly encourage looking him up and his training, because I have never met the man personally. We've talked on occasion. We've shared emails. But I tell you, the heart that he has for the security of the church is amazing. And I would just encourage, if you're looking for a great training potential, is to contact him directly through General Response. You just type in John Riley or General Response training into Google or your search engine, and it'll come up. And I would just, it is a vital first step, I think, to having effective training. And he runs scenarios like we would with core values, and that is some of the best way to train and the best way to fail, because that's really where you want to fail, is at the training, so that you don't do it in a situation like what Paul's describing today. Thank you so much for taking time to listen to this podcast. If you really enjoyed it and you found it of benefit to you, we really appreciate your feedback. There's several different ways that you can provide us feedback. One of them is to subscribe to the podcast, is to share it with others, and another is to contact us directly, particularly if you have any questions or concerns, or you want more information on how to host a seminar in your community. You can contact me directly at danielblevins@cv@heart.com, or you can go to our website. That's cv-ministries.com. Both of those will get you in the right direction. Until next time, make sure that you're out there protecting the flock with a heart of service.